OK, so as we've just been hearing, Dominic Raab resigned as Deputy Prime Minister after a bullying inquiry found that he had acted in an intimidating fashion with unreasonably and persistently aggressive conduct. But Raab didn't go quietly. He says his departure sets a dangerous precedent because it sets a low threshold for bullying, which will encourage spurious complaints. Well, join me now is social policy analyst Rakib Ehsan and the former editor of Labour List, Peter Edwards, a chap I've often had locked horns with, a superb debater. Welcome to you both. Let's start with you, Dr. Rakib, if we can. What do you make of this idea that the unelected civil service is now the tail wagging the dog and they can get rid of any minister they don't like, particularly those with a Brexit bent?
Well, I'd say, Martin, that there's definitely scope for civil servants to provide advice and guidance. I think the issue here is to what extent are they intervening when it comes to matters of government agenda, especially reforms, based on their own political beliefs. Ultimately, civil servants, based on the Civil Service Code, are expected to be impartial, which ultimately means they should serve all governments equally to their best of their ability, irrespective of their own political persuasions. And I think that's the key point of the debate here.
OK, Peter, I'd like to bring you in here as a voice from the Labour side of the camp. Do you think Raab really had to go? He deserved to be booted out like this?
Yes, and he would have been sacked had he not resigned, and Rishi Sunak's office and sources close to him seem to have made that clear. I'd like to pick up on one other point as well, which is Brexit. I don't think Brexit has anything to do with this. Of course, Dominic Raab was a Brexit secretary and he voted for leaving the EU just like Rishi Sunak did. But civil servants are there to deliver government policy, and the reason that Dominic Raab had to resign before he would have been sacked is not to do with Brexit. It's because he humiliated officials, he used very tough language, because permanent secretaries complained to him about his behaviour, and according to one account, when he thought people were talking too much, he put his hand towards their faces, which is not appropriate in an office. It's
worth picking up, though, Dominic, of course, denies all of those allegations, denies everything. But let's look to somebody who's seen as a leading luminaire on the Labour side of the camp, Peter. Gordon Brown, in his own memoir, came out. He used to throw newspapers, pens, mobile phones, Coca-Cola cans at aides. He would abruptly leave meetings halfway through people speaking. He was always shouting at people. Is it not a case of there's one rule for you and one rule for the Tories?
No, I don't think so. So first of all, Gordon Brown was not always shouting at people. Secondly, I worked for a Labour MP in the Ed Miliband era and got to know some people that worked for Gordon Brown. I won't use their names, but there was enormous personal loyalty to the people that worked for Gordon Brown. That's because he was a man with a vision. He was a man of notoriously hair-shirted tastes. He didn't like the trappings and the wealth of politics. He had a global vision for saving the banking crisis and the financial crisis in 2008. And of course, the thing when you're a Labour anorak, as I am, and you read all the biographies, is he was also known for all the personal touches, the handwritten notes, the personal members of staff going through tough times like bereavement or illness. So he was a kind and multifaceted individual. And of course, he had a temper like we all do at the time. But, you know, you have to think, why is there such loyalty to him among the people that worked most closely with him?
Dr. Ehsan, maybe that's the way. You can be a tyrant so long as you send people nice letters.
Well, listen, I think everyone has different perspectives on what bullying constitutes. Much of what I've read, to be honest, in my hometown of Luton, people say that's just the bread and butter, everyday happenings of the workplace, if truth be told. I think that when we're looking at the issue of the civil service, I think the key here is impartiality. And I think that there'll be many Conservative MPs who will be quite disappointed with this outcome. And they will believe that there may well be too many civil servants who are ultimately more interested in blocking government reform. As I said, there's a capacity for civil servants to provide advice and guidance. But I think that if there's politically motivated interventions, if that is taking place, then I do think that's a very serious issue.
What's the evidence for that, please? What's the evidence for politically motivated interventions by civil servants?
Well, there'll be even examples of Twitter accounts affiliated with the civil service being abused, making very clear politically motivated statements. I think you'd agree if that was happening under a Labour government, you would be condemning that. So equally, you should be condemning that kind of behaviour in this case as well.
Well, as far as I'm aware, there's not been a suggestion they're doing that in the course of their duties. The civil service are always independent, and we're still ploughing through the 48.
It should be independent. It should be independent, and I think there's definitely the government. Government has the right to say if they believe that when it comes to those matters of neutrality and impartiality, if they believe that they're not being upheld the way they should be.
Okay, Peter.
Government have the right to do that.
Let Peter respond to that.
So there's no suggestion in anything we've seen so far that bias over Brexit or government policy played a part in this. The primary driver of Dominic Raab blowing up his career was his own behaviour. And of course, we all have frustrations in the workplace, and we're all entitled to give feedback to colleagues, particularly if we feel their work is not good enough. And there's a difference between saying woeful and using inappropriate language, potentially triggering someone having health problems and stress leave, or sticking your hand in their face.
Utterly woeful, utterly useless. Come on, if you're, I think there's too many shrinking violets here, and I think that people need to develop a thicker skin. And I make this point. I know that you're affiliated with Labour. Listen, I don't think Labour should be in the business of covering for civil servants who may well be making politically motivated interventions. Because believe me, if Labour starts introducing reforms that they might not like, the civil servants, then that's going to be an issue as well.
Yeah, OK, so none of it's been proven that there are links. But one thing I think was very interesting yesterday was we initially thought this is like young people, snowflakes, as you said, shrinking violence. Actually, Dominic Raab was quite clear this was more senior civil servants who've been around for a long time. In fact, around since the Blair days. Is there something in the idea that the people running the civil service a lot of those guys were put in by Tony Blair? So put it to you both, are they still doing Labour's batting?
No, I'll take that on if that's right, because Rakib has talked so much. So no, because the vast, vast majority of civil service roles are not appointed by politicians, they're appointed by civil servants. I think there might be one or two exceptions in the private office. Secondly, Brexit is government policy, and this is why I don't think it's about bias over Brexit, and it's not about bias between political parties. Even Keir Starmer keeps giving speeches saying the Brexit question is settled. So whether you're talking about previous ministers, the current administration, which is led by a Brexiteer Prime Minister, or potentially a Labour administration, were it to win, the Brexit question has been settled and we have left the EU. And I think we've got to just confront reality and not talk over people, as we've heard this morning, when they disagree with us, which is that there was some work perceived as poor quality, and Dominic Raab didn't have the personal skill set to provide feedback in the right way.
Okay, sort of bring Rakib in there now. Are we heading towards a position, though, where the inability to criticise poor performance will lead to government just becoming stodge?
Well, I think that's the risk. As I said, if you set the threshold for bullying at such a low level, that the potential to paralyse government activity. By the way, I don't think I've talked that much, and luckily for me, I've got a thick skin or I might accuse you of bullying. But I'd make the point that ultimately the government, and that includes the former Deputy Prime Minister, if he believes that, I think he described it as a very small minority, if he believes that they are possibly not happy with forms of government reform and they're being obstructionist, then he's entitled to make that point.
OK, we do actually have a full frame now. The definition of bullying from the report itself might be worth pulling up here. It is the legitimate, reasonable and constructive criticism of a worker's performance will not amount to bullying. It defines bullying as intimidating or insulting behaviour that makes an individual feel uncomfortable, frightened, less respected or put down. So
subjective.
Put it quickly back to you then, Rakib. By that definition, it doesn't seem that Dominic Raab maybe passed the threshold.
Well, I mean, I think there'll also be the point that just some people have different sensitivity thresholds as well. So I think perhaps what we need to have a discussion here, there needs to be a tightening of the Civil Service Code, and more generally, there needs to be a tighter definition of that when it comes to bullying, because I think that is incredibly subjective, and it depends on how sensitive a person is. OK, Peter, final words you.
Independent investigation by a barrister. The barrister is not woke. We've no idea how he voted in the referendum. We've no idea on his party political persuasion. He's a skilled, competent, experienced lawyer, and he's delivered his verdict. Just because people don't like it, they shouldn't try to change the rules.